Facebook.
Okay.
Well, good evening, and thank you everybody for being so patient. We're all set for a wonderful talk tonight. On behalf of Harif, the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, I'd like to welcome you all. Our mission, as most of you know by now, is to raise awareness of the heritage, culture, and history of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. We have a website, www.harif.org. In order to receive details of our events, you have to be subscribed to our website. We've got a sister website called Point of No Return, which keeps you up to date with the news. Please do subscribe to that as well. This session is being recorded. It's live on Facebook at the moment, and there will be a recording up in a matter of hours, and you can access that by going to the Harif YouTube channel, which is on our website. There will be an opportunity, hopefully, to ask our speaker questions. Please do use your real name and not iPad or iPhone. So on to the subject of tonight's talk by Jay Prosser, who's joining us from somewhere in the UK. Jay has been on a quest to reclaim his Jewish identity and connect with his family roots in Iraq, in India, China, and Singapore. And he has just published a book called Loving Strangers. And here it is. It is a family memoir which builds bridges across the terrible divides of our time and explores integration and even intermarriage between ethnic groups. It was published by Black Spring Press, and it's already won a prize, the Hazel Rowley Prize in the US in 2020. Jay is a teacher where he teaches and researches at the Center for Jewish Studies and the School of English at the University of Leeds. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Jay for his presentation. And thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you, Lynn. It's a real honor, as I said, to be asked to do this talk for Harif. There were a few technical problems at the beginning, so please just shout at me if I'm not visible or if the sound suddenly goes. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes and show a lot of images because they're quite important in my book. And for the last 20 years, I've been writing an Asian Jewish family biography during my family history. And this hyphenation of Asian and Jewish, I think, is quite new and quite specific. So the Asian side is multiple. So in this photograph, which is quite important in my book, in the center you see my mother, and on her right is her father. So my mother grew up in the small but very significant, as I'll be telling you, Jewish community of Singapore, and her father was born in Bombay, but his own family were Baghdadi Jews. He came from Iraq, and her mother was Chinese and converted to Judaism. I'm getting a strange echo. I don't know if that's me.
That is you, yes. I think you've got more than one
Device. Is it?
Speaker on.
Not anymore. Are you getting the echo as well?
Yeah,
a little bit, yes. Okay, don't worry.
I'm out of everything except this laptop.
Don't worry. I think we can more or less hear.
Okay.
Yeah.
And So the paradigm of loving strangers was really important in my mother's family. So her parents came from very different religions, cultures, spoke different languages initially, and they came together not despite, but actually because of these divides between them. There were also divides around empires, so they came from different empires as well. So my grandmother from the Chinese Empire just before it collapsed, and my grandfather leaving his family leaving Iraq when it was part of the Ottoman Empire, but then coming to the British Empire. These different empires with their own different formations of ethnicities and religions. But this is a pattern, as I wrote this book over the last 20 years, that I found went back over many generations, this pattern of loving strangers, indeed, to, I think, the foundations of Jewishness, of Jewish identity in my family. So for this book, it's not an academic book, although I am primarily an academic and have done research on various things. I did have to do a huge amount of research into different moments in history that affected my family that they lived through, including, as I've suggested, for my grandmother, the end of the Qing Empire in China, with my grandfather coming from Iraq, knowing something about Jews in Iraq, and also the spice trade. His family were involved in the spice trade in India. And this family, my mother and her parents, fleeing from Singapore during the Japanese occupation. So it's a story that involved a huge amount of research into these signal moments in history, and also a lot of travel. So I went back to China, I went to India, I went to Singapore. The only place I didn't go to is to Iraq. So it's a very substantial archive that's within my book, but at the same time, it comes to me in a very contained form, and that is the camphorwood chest. This is the camphorwood chest, in fact, that I grew up with as a child, and that's on the cover of my book. By the way, I think my photographer for the book, Leslie Hakeem Dawek, I should mention, this is her image. Many of the images in the book are by Leslie, and they are really, she is so talented. She's really brought to life these objects. So this was the small family archive that I grew up with, and it contained this Asian Jewish family history. And in the 13 homes that I lived in as a child, this treasure box always sat in the hall. It was very much associated with travel, sort of as if it was on its way in or on its way out. And as a child, I was completely fixated on this camphorwood chest. I would spend hours sitting before it and looking at studying the pictures, trying to work out what they were about. They were clearly about a journey. It was a very exotic space that had nothing to do with my immediate surroundings, mainly growing up in Europe, of two men in a sampan passing this Chinese pagoda on the top of the box, and then coming back the other way on the front of the box. And I'd feel my way into the carvings with my fingers, and I'd try to bring these stories to life. And the magic of the chest, it really was a magical object for me, was to do with the chest being associated with my mother. It was the one piece of furniture that she brought with her when she migrated from Singapore to England in 1961. So the one large item of furniture that she brought with her on that ship. And it contained, when I was growing up, all of the important documents in the family's life, particularly associated with her family. And these are some of the items. So what you see, I'm going to be talking a little bit about this. I don't know if now my technology is good enough to do this, but My mother here, as a model, I'll be talking about that. And then if I can just focus in on this. Here and show you, this is my mother's handwriting trying to trace her grandfather. She didn't get it right. I only realized that when I went back actually and did the research. So this was an amazing archive, and my mother, I was so drawn to this chest. I would sit by the side of the chest with my mother, and she would tell me stories. She would take objects out from this archive and tell me stories. So about my grandfather, who was a spice trader traveling through India and in Singapore, about my great grandfather who left what she called Mesopotamia, and she would say, and that's a country that doesn't exist anymore. And my grandmother, who was abandoned as a child, as a baby, by the side of the river in China. So these were very fairy tale stories for me, and in my head they merged with the images on the chest. And I felt as though I was being drawn into this world of the chest, like a threshold moment in, for example, C.S. Lewis's wardrobe stories, where you move through the back of the wardrobe and you're in another world. So it really took me out of my immediate surroundings in Europe. And this enchantment with the chest was helped by this smell of camphor, which is so distinct. It had no connection with the other woods that were in our houses growing up, which was sort of very earthy, solid, northern European, which didn't have this spice, this scent of spice. I very much associated this scent with the spice trading of my grandfather. And camphor wood boxes have this scent for a reason, because camphor was used to preserve documents, precious documents, textiles. And actually, I would be surprised if someone here doesn't have a camphor wood chest in the family at some point, because if you have any connection to Southeast Asia in particular, especially a colonial connection, it seems, there is normally a camphor wood chest in the family because of their hugely powerful preservative qualities. And so they've been used by migrants for generations to maintain and transport precious items. Over the last 20 years, then, I have been going back through this chest with my mother now as an adult. And you'll have to read my book to find out what was the instigating moment for me to return. But this is a journey that took me to an unexpected destination, in the sense that I thought this book was first of all about my mother, but actually in the relationship and the work that we did together, I found that what happened was a kind of transmission of this legacy onto me. And whereas I was a Buddhist 20 years ago when I started this book, and pretty serious about it, on the verge of becoming a monk, not so interested in Judaism, the journey has taken me back to my family's Judaism. And I've now joined the wonderful York Liberal Jewish community, and I think there's some members of my community here today, which I connected with because it's also a community where you would not expect to find Jews, given York's terrible history of the pogrom in the Middle Ages. And that was also the case in Singapore, a place where you would not expect to find Jews, and India, where there are so few, particularly Baghdadi Jews, left. And I think this was one of my reasons for coming late to Judaism, was not fitting in, not quite knowing what my history was, not being able to connect with Jewishness as it is, as I predominantly encountered it as a child. So as we went back through the chest, there's a kind of, I realized as an adult, there's an archaeology in the sense that the most recent history is on top. And the further down we went into the chest, the further back in time we went. So right on the surface here is my mother's passenger list from the SS Corfu, which was the boat that she took over to England from Singapore in 1961, and then various letters. So this was a kind of traveling across vast geographies, as well as a reversal in time, but an achronology that took me forwards in my own personal pilgrimage, if I can put it like that. So I want to tell you about to sort of bring to life, which is what my book tries to do, various characters in my family and their times and places through objects. And I'm not sure, I can't see the participants here, but I have a feeling that my wonderful colleague Hannah Wilson might be here, who's just about to start some very important archival work in Manchester, working with Holocaust objects. And I feel very fortunate to be working with her around a similar project. So the power of objects to bring to life people, their times and their places. And each part of my book takes a different object and tries to resurrect that person and time and place. And so I'm going to select a few objects to tell you about here. So the first is some jewelry. You've actually got two pieces of jewelry here. One is a tiny, they're both sort of silver plate, cheap silver. And one is a tiny bangle, which we realized my mother would have worn as a baby. And the other is an anklet. And maybe if you've seen Indian dancing, you have already connected this anklet with India. And these two pieces of jewelry represent my mother's experience of fleeing from the fall of Singapore and then her time as a refugee child in India. So just to take the anklet, which was the object that really fascinated me, because of its, I think because it carries the affect, the experience, the emotion of the child who wore it. My mother as a 3 to 6 year old in India as a refugee. It's quite battered, a bell has broken off, it's obviously being worn. And my mother told me that her mother, my grandmother, said that as a child in India, in a refugee camp, she was very disturbed and she used to sleepwalk through this refugee camp. And so we wondered, my mother and I wondered together, did her mother give her this anklet as a way to wake the child or even to wake her parents if she got up and wandered round the camp? She was disturbed as a refugee child. She'd left Singapore at 3, and she'd also left on the very last boat to make it out of Singapore safely. The day before the Japanese invaded Singapore, before they landed on Pulau Ubin, it was called, the small island neighboring Singapore, and then made their incursion into Singapore. So this was February 1942, and this is the Felix Roussel. And again, there's a sense of magic for me that the family even made it out, because the Felix Roussel was bombed 9 times. I read about this in Kew Archives, very close to where my parents live now, 9 times as she tried to load up with refugees. And then she zigzagged all the way to Bombay. And when you read the ship's records, they say that Captain Snowling thanked the group of Hebrew women who were praying constantly in Hebrew for basically assuring the ship's safety. He thought that it was only this small group of Jewish women from Singapore who had enabled the ship to land safely in Bombay, so close to come to being sunk by the Japanese bombers. Who got on the ship was my mother, her father, her mother, and two sisters. So my mother again is the child in the middle. And we worked out together from the age that my mother is here that this would have been taken, this photograph would have been taken a couple of months before the fall of Singapore, once Pearl Harbor had fallen, which was December 1941, and pretty immediately, the same night as Pearl Harbor was attacked, the Japanese also sent out attack planes to Singapore, which was bombed the following morning. So I'm very struck by how everyone in this photograph looks incredibly serious and a little bit startled, and that is unusual for studio portraits of this time. And so as I look at this photograph, I think there always is an interesting interaction between the subject who examines objects and the object themselves, the object itself. They look to me to be sort of caught in the headlights of history here, to have a sense of what is coming. And I also wonder if this could have been used as some kind of identity document, because my grandmother at this point was an illegal immigrant to Singapore, so she had no legal papers at all. And yet she also managed to get out on that ship to Bombay. And I haven't been able to find no other instance of a whole family that was mixed racially that managed to be evacuated on a British boat coming out of Singapore. There are very few instances of Chinese women being evacuated. There are some Chinese men and some Chinese women, but they tended to work for the British government, and my grandmother absolutely did not. And I've found no examples of elderly Jewish men or Jewish men being evacuated from Singapore. They were, after this, they were interned by the Japanese, and my grandfather managed to somehow wangle their way onto this ship. And I've not quite been able to work out how they did that. They went to a refugee camp in Bombay. My mother remembers mills and a sort of compound area, and she's here on the left with a new sister and her older sister. My grandmother had two more children in India. So they were there for 4 years. It was 1946 before they could come back. And my mother's best friend, my mother's here on the on your far left, and she always has her hands clasped in this very posed way in many of her photos, including even now, I have to say. Next to her on her immediate right, between her and her mother, is her best friend, who was a Muslim girl, and then my grandmother, who was Chinese, and then to my grandmother's right, a Hindu Indian girl who helped with the children. So what you have is a very sort of mixed, extended family, which really interests me. And I've often wondered how my grandmother experienced India as a Chinese woman who was herself twice displaced from China and then from Singapore, both times, by the way, as a refugee, in a Jewish refugee camp in Bombay. So the Jewish refugee camp in Bombay was supported, I found out, by Jews in Bombay, mainly Baghdadi Jewish diaspora. The refugee camp was in Baikala, and I expect if you know Jewish India, you'll know about Baikala. It was the first area that Baghdadi Jews settled, and a very significant Jewish area. But even then, and also now, predominantly a Muslim area, when I went back to Bombay, or Mumbai as it's now called, it was predominantly Muslims who helped me discover Jewish Bombay. I'd done my research, and there was a huge sense of the people I spoke to, a huge sense of nostalgia for the emptying out of Jews from India, and a real sense that people were telling me, we grew up with Jews here. Jews were among my best friends. So there was no animosity at all. This is the synagogue that my family would have gone to, the Magen David Synagogue in Baikala. And next door to it is the Jacob Sassoon High School. My mother was too young to go to school, but an older cousin went there. It's now a predominantly Muslim school, and yet, at least when I was there, last there, the pupils still honor the school commitment to say Hebrew prayers every day, which is startling, even though they are predominantly Muslim children there. I found that very moving. When my mother came back to Singapore in 1946, she was a refugee for a further 5 years. So the family were moved to 5 successive homes from a refugee camp, then gradually to more and more solid homes. And under the British military administration, some conditions were actually worse than under the Japanese occupation. Rice rationing went down, for example, and when some prisoners, male prisoners who had been taken to Japan and interned in Japan came back, they were actually shocked at the conditions that they found in Singapore. But things started to turn around when David Marshall appeared on the scene, and he was the first chief minister, effectively the first prime minister of Singapore in 1955-57, around then. And he was key to paving the way for Singapore's independence from Britain, to it to becoming a post-colonial nation. And it's very important to me that he was also, like my family, Baghdadi Jewish, came from with a very similar family history. His family were also traders, and Baghdadi Jews, it seems to me, in a lot of different places have been intermediaries. And so the fact that he was Baghdadi Jewish does not seem accidental to me, because he was able to broker between the predominant Chinese population of Singapore and the British and other communities. He is sort of written out of Singapore's history in its birth as a modern nation, of course, overwritten by Lee Kuan Yew. And if you read Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore story, his memoirs, he's weirdly, oddly anti-Semitic about David Marshall. My mother grew up just around the corner from David Marshall in the poor area of Singapore. Marshall transformed what it was to be not only Singaporean, but also what it was to be Jewish in Singapore. The 1950s were a wonderful time, my mother says, to be Jewish in Singapore. And here she is outside the still stunning Magen Abbot in Singapore. And this image to me sort of captures the light of this moment, the hopefulness as well. She became president of the Menorah Club, which was the social club, the youth club for Jews in Singapore. And that itself emerged out of Habonim. Those of you who know about Habonim, again, connected with Jewish identity and also Israel. Very positive identity moment for Jews worldwide after the foundation of Israel. So she worked her way out of this poor childhood, and right down sort of in the Camphorwood chest, these were things that she would not show to me. Her modeling shots and albums. She became the face of Longcom Singapore and quite a significant model on the island. And this was her way of working her way out of a poor childhood. Her father made her leave school. Before she'd finished school, she was only 15, and she got a clerical job, an office job. But as a way to make extra money, she took up modeling and did extremely well. And I think that the fact that she became the face of Longcom Singapore says a lot about the cosmopolitan ideals that Singapore had of itself of this moment. Of course, my mother being Asian Jewish in that mixed, very culturally mixed Asian sense that I suggested at the beginning. She couldn't afford to own any of the clothes or shoes that she modeled, but these were a pair of shoes that she absolutely could not resist. You can see these absolutely crazy heels that these shoes have. My mother is a bit of a shoe fetishist, or was, and when I was growing up, if you opened certain cupboards, there would be an avalanche of shoes that would overwhelm you. And these shoes seemed to bookend for me, as I was writing the book, the anklet, the anklet hoop, the sad refugee child Indian anklet with the bell broken off, as if she had come through something. And in fact, it was around this time that she met my father, who was a young British officer serving in the Malayan emergency. Again, part of British colonial history that we don't pay enough attention to. They are also loving strangers, my parents, because my father was fighting for the British military against what were then called communist terrorists, but you could understand as Chinese freedom fighters fighting for independence of Malaya. And my mother then came to England, having met my father in Singapore. And yeah, there's another story there, but again, you'll have to read my book. So to move on to the next object. So this is a tape cassette that came into the family, was recorded in 1970. So already now it's 54 years old. And it's my grandfather singing. So Lawrence, I don't know if you would be able to please share the sound.
Lawrence, can you share the sound?
Okay, turn the sound off on your machine. Don't.
So whilst Lawrence is finding that.
Yeah, no, just getting it ready.
Okay, I will say that you will hear songs in many different languages, and he was already 80 when he recorded this. And I want you to notice how much he gives it an oomph.
Sorry, it's going to take me a second. I wasn't expecting that. Sorry.
Sorry, we have had.
With England's crown today, we hail our Queen and pray, God save the Queen. And never gives us cause to sing with heart and joy, God save the Queen.
Did you hear that? Oops.
Sometimes romantic one song baby. Remember what I say and be true. I'm a good girl. I must go. Goodbye for my country and you. Everybody should go. In vain I should say. You are the blessing of my heart and true. Say it.
Okay, Lawrence, thank you. I think you can stop it.
Yes, right.
Yeah, thank you. I apologize for the sound quality there. It's not brilliant, but I have put a link from my website if people are interested. It seems to me that we don't actually pay enough attention to how song and music is carried as part of the family archive in our various families. It's easier to look at photographs and letters and objects and so on, but many of us grew up with songs that go back over generations. And certainly one of the songs on this tape, I certainly grew up with. My mother used to sing it. So on this tape, my grandfather sings in many different languages, including Arabic, Urdu, English. You heard him there. You also heard Hindi. And I think my colleague Ananya Kabir might be here because she was key in helping me translate a lot of these songs. And the song that he ends with there, Say, darling, say, when I'm far away, sometimes you may think of me, dear, is incredibly poignant to me because that's exactly what we're doing 54 years after this tape was made and 52 years after my grandfather died. So something lives on in his voice. The fact that he spoke many different languages, again, is not a coincidence. It was key to his profession as a spice trader, a family profession that went back many, many generations, as far as I've been able to see, back to the 1700s. And the languages that he sings and the places indeed that he sings about connect, I realize, to the spice route, as do the many places that my family traveled to or came from. So my grandmother came from where I put a cross. I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but Shantou, I've written here, Canton. So my grandmother came from around there. Singapore, I've done a little island down at the bottom right. Bombay, of course, and then going back to Basra and Baghdad. So the songs captured his travels as a spice trader. He worked for the Borneo Sumatra Trading Company. These are some of the brands that company used in Singapore. And they were, I discovered, themselves a descendant of the Dutch East India Company. Of course, the Dutch, as well as the British, were in Southeast Asia. And they became hugely exploitative of middlemen like my grandfather. And in fact, he ended up losing his livelihood and becoming quite impoverished. This was them in better times. My grandfather here on the far left, and then with his brother on the far right, Ezekiel, who died young and lost a leg. It's funny, these glosses that end up being attached to particular family members when we're told stories by our parents or whoever. And then an older cousin, my mother thinks, here in the middle. And we think this was taken in the 1920s, around the 1920s, when they'd arrived in Singapore, and they'd come from India, where they'd spent probably about 10, 15 years. And the older cousin in the middle has what later gets called a Nehru collar. That's what he's wearing on his jacket. And so seems to have brought something of India with him, where the younger men sort of fit into British Western kind of suave film star quality looks. In India, where they'd come from, the family, the Elias family, had a spice trading company, more than spice trading, in fact. One relative became the copra king. Coconut materials, which were used in all kinds of things. They traded in Crawford Market, and you can just about here, I think, see some trading stalls in Bombay. And they lived in Baikala, and they also would have gone, this previous generation, to the Magen David synagogue. So my grandfather, when he was a refugee in India during the Second World War, was in fact returning to a kind of home for him. And one of the songs that he sings on the tape is from Bombay Kababu, which is translated as The Gentleman from Bombay. And my grandfather in Singapore was known as Jacob Bombay-wala. There were so many Jacobs, the question became, how did you distinguish your Jacobs from each other? And he was called Jacob Bombay-wala because he so left his heart and soul and spirit really in India. He loved Indian food, he loved Indian music. He spoke many different languages. He had a love of Arabic and also Hindi. He was more comfortable in those than in other languages. Many of his songs, most of his songs, he was there are many of my family's songs actually, not just his, are about extreme feeling, journeying through life, through places, feeling like a stranger, and yearning as well, this very powerful word. So there's a kind of mood also that's inherited in my family. And the way that my grandfather sings as well, full-throated, no holds barred, is sort of what brings me back. It's part of what brings me back to Judaism in particular, and the liturgy of Judaism, which I love, and the minor notes as well as the major notes, which of course you get in liturgy and synagogues. So if I've got time, Lynn and Lawrence, can I take people quickly through the last object?
Yes, of course.
So this is a quilt which my Chinese grandmother, made throughout her life. And I want you to remember this little pink square in the left-hand corner bottom, which I'll come back to. But this quilt she made throughout her life until my mother, at a certain point when we were children, she went back to Singapore, and her mother gave it to us and said, finish it for your children. She hadn't finished it. And the materials, when my mother and I studied it, we realized it's made up of the different places and identities of the family. So you have some of the batiks of Malaya as it then was. You have, I don't know if you can just make out, quite near to the pink square, there is a green bagpiper, a Scottish bagpiper. So some material associated with British colonialism. There are the flowery dresses, flowery patterns of the dresses that my grandmother wore when she converted to Judaism. They're sometimes called lappas or rupas. I've heard them called various things, these Iraqi Jewish dresses. There are the madras checks that my grandfather wore on his sarongs and so on. And then these Chinese silks. So she made this material out of all the different parts of the family's lives. My grandmother was born in what's now called Chaozhou. In Mandarin, it was called Chaozhou, but in Fujian, it's called Chaoan. And it's in Fujian province, which is southeast China, quite close to Guangdong, or as it well, it's not in Mandarin, Canton. And when we went back, we discovered it's another really magical city. And as you can see, it actually looks like the carvings on the camphorwood chest. You've got the wall, you've got the pagoda, you've even got a fantastic river. It's a Tang Dynasty city, and she had an amazing start in life. She really did have a miraculous life. She was placed as a baby in a Moses basket by the side of the river in Chawan. She was given up as a baby, and she was found by a fisherman. Sometimes it was a fisherman, sometimes it was a farmer. My mother used to change the pattern of these stories each time she told them to me, so I was never quite sure what was coming. And he took her in, he adopted her, and he raised her as his own. Initially, he didn't. In the morning, he heard this child crying, and then he left her because he could see that she had smallpox, and he didn't want anything to do with this clearly ill child. But in the evening, as he punted back home, his compassion was drawn on, and he took this child and took her in. When we went back to Chaozhou, my mother here on the far left, we were told this is not an uncommon story. Of course not. For girls at the very tail end of the Qing Empire, before Mao in particular outlawed the practice of giving up girl babies. This was not an uncommon practice to give up particularly girl children. And that her story, my grandmother's story, was shared. Indeed, her full name before she converted was Simcoe Wei. So Sim being her family name or clan name. And we discovered that this was a very common name in this area. And her story also of migration to Singapore was very common as well. There was a lot of famine in this area at this time. There was a lot of unrest with the Japanese invasion in the 1930s, the war between the nationalists and the communists in China, and then the rise of communism. Many Chinese got out of China when they could. It was fascinating to me when we went back that my mother seemed to fit right in, and I'd never sort of thought about the Chinese aspects of my mother and the Chinese legacy. I'd sort of recognized the Jewishness, but this was really revelatory. And in this house that these four elders invited us into, my mother suddenly found herself speaking Hokkien, her mother's native language, and she realized that she knew a little bit of it, but she didn't realize that she could communicate, have a full conversation in it. So something ancestral returned, and it was a really very moving moment. So I asked you to remember this little pink square. Maybe those of you who've been to the Foundling Museum in Bloomsbury will have already thought a little bit about this. When my mother was growing up, her mother's most precious possession was a little piece of peach cloth, very rich cloth, and she used to take it out of, they had a chest as well when she was growing up. She used to take it out of her chest, this chest, and look at it and then put it back in the chest. And my mother could never work out what's so precious about that piece of cloth. Unfortunately, that chest and that cloth, I wonder if it was a kind of camphorwood chest that my mother grew up with, but both of those, pretty much all the family possessions, were destroyed when the family had to evacuate Singapore in the 1940s. But my grandmother told my mother that when she was found, she was wrapped in very rich cloth, a pink cloth. And so we wonder if this scrap was part of that, that she had kept. And my grandmother's foster father told her that she came from a wealthy family. We don't know if he had evidence, what evidence he had for that, but was it the cloth? I think particularly when you have family stories of migration, and particularly when there's a foundling story involved, there are lots of gaps. So what I do in the book, what I did in the research, was to go back and find, well, who were the rich people living around Chaozhou? And there is this amazing complex compound of a trader who had many connections to Singapore in particular, to the British and so on. And so what I've done is to try and imagine that Chinese legacy for my grandmother, to give her something back of that lost story. Nancy Miller, who's written a wonderful Jewish memoir called What They Saved, describes family memoir, particularly, I think, with Jewish diaspora histories, as islands of memory in oceans of forgetting, which I truly love. It's just a beautiful way of putting it. So the question for me was, how do I get from one island of memory to another island of memory and navigate this ocean of forgetting? And in part, my book draws on fictional techniques and lyrical techniques to do that. So my grandmother made the journey over to Singapore in the 1930s. Many migrants left China for what they called Silat Po, over Nanyang, or Southern Ocean, as they called this ocean between China and Singapore. And they went to be domestic laborers, coolies mainly, for British colonials. And my grandmother was among them. She first of all lived in a kampong, a Chinese village in Singapore. And my grandfather, then quite well-to-do Iraqi Jewish trader, got her to look after him and his family. And then he married her and she converted to Judaism. She took her Judaism very, very seriously, so much so that when I recently went back to Singapore, the rabbi said to me, your grandmother had such a commitment to Judaism and to the Jewish community. We really respect her. In fact, this rabbi never knew her, but something of her reputation lived on. And I think with Judaism, and with my grandfather, she found a home. My grandparents it was very important to them that they have a Jewish wedding. This is the ketubah. But they had to wait decades, although they were married previously, they had to wait decades to have a fully Jewish wedding in a synagogue and for my grandmother to be converted properly, because there wasn't a rabbi who was willing to do it, in fact, until 1964. My grandfather was already in his 70s and my grandmother was already in her 50s. My grandmother is now buried in the Jewish area of an intercommunal cemetery in Singapore. There is no Jewish cemetery anymore in Singapore. It's part of a shared space, but there is a Jewish area. And this was the name that she took when she met my grandfather, in fact, very early on, before she'd formally converted, Esther Elias. And there's no evidence of her Chinese history, but I think that was always a part of her as well. And so something of that I've tried to restore. So her life was a bit of a patchwork, actually, like her quilt, of different places, different moments in her life. So those are my objects, and just keep going. My book takes out other objects too. So they're all the love letters that my parents wrote to each other over a 9-month separation period after they'd met. They'd 2-month courtship in Singapore. When they were becoming loving strangers, there's an Iraqi family tree, Jewish family tree that goes back to the 1700s. There's my father's diary that he kept when he was a young lieutenant fighting in the Malayan emergency. And then there's my grandmother's handbag, which she carried with her everywhere until she died. She didn't let it leave her side, and which contains some extraordinary documents, including multiple copies of attempts at registration as a Singapore citizen, and the different places that my grandparents attempted to declare their marriage and tried to marry and so on. She was very unsure about her status. So this handbag is a kind of archive within this archive of the Camphorwood chest. So thank you very much. I really apologize for the technical difficulties there. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think that was absolutely fascinating, Jay. I've only just received the book and I've just about gone through it very, very rapidly, but the writing is absolutely terrific. And it draws you into the story, or there's several stories, obviously. You know, what an amazing odyssey your family had, you know, halfway across the world. I think the chest is just such a brilliant kind of literary device, apart from anything. I know it actually exists, but it is like a repository of memory, you know, of unbelievable. I mean, you're so lucky to have it, you know, because so I'm sure a lot of families would have loved to have a chest like that, you know, with letters. And I mean, wonderful that your mother thought to keep everything. She must be such a hoarder.
She is a hoarder, but I think I would be surprised if you know, if you don't bits of have like hoarders in your family, because it seems to me that everyone who has some experience of being moved from somewhere, there are things that are kept, that might not be kept in other families. In other words, if you have an experience of being a refugee or being expelled from somewhere, there are things that get lost, but also there's an attempt to keep things, bizarre things that wouldn't otherwise be kept. Like, for example, also in this chest is this a very ancient pair of scissors. It turns out these sewing scissors, you know, belonged to my grandmother, and she used them because she made all the clothes in the family because they were so poor and so on. And the chest, you know, all credit to my mother. It's her literary device. She's the real storyteller here. She's the first storyteller here. I'm simply the messenger.
Everyone's invited to, you know, ask questions. Please do write them in the chat. Well, my question is, did your mother's siblings, are they still Jewish? Are their families Jewish?
That's a very good question. My mother's brother was, sadly, he was younger than her, but he passed away a few years ago. And his children, one of whom remained in Singapore, have become even more Jewish, you know, to the point of one of them studying with the Lubavitch in New York for a certain period. So the others, no. The others, no. It's a good question. What happens? And I was aware of that reading Jonathan Sacks, Will We Have Jewish Grandchildren? That was very transformative for me reading that. You know, what are the costs of intermarriage? Because there are costs, there are benefits. And I think it depends on, I think that's what your question is getting at. I think it's a very good question. And yeah, there were costs and benefits. But I think my story shows that you can return.
Fantastic. There was another question which I can't remember. I can't remember what I was going to ask you. But Amy wants to know, where is the chest now? Is it in your possession, or does your mother still have it?
Baruch Hashem, both my parents are still alive, and the chest is still in the hall of my mother's house. But yes, I guess it will come to me eventually, but I hope not too soon.
Absolutely. Baruch Hashem. Just wondered, you've got a few words of Arabic in your book, as far as I could see. Abdalek, for instance. So did your mother speak much Judeo-Arabic to you? Or, I mean,
We
No.
don't know. We don't know what. Sometimes she doesn't even know what this language is. You know, she'll say something, and she said, "Well, my father says that." You know, and I'll say, "Well, what language is that?" She say, "I have no idea." You know, it's just that we grew up with these many languages. So some, yeah, there is some Arabic. She did grow up with some. I think she can speak some and understand some. She's always surprised by how much she knows. Once she starts a conversation, something comes back. So I think my grandfather was very cosmopolitan. Singapore was obviously very diverse, and there was a lot of integration, a lot of mixing. You know, also having done research on academic research on the Mahalla, the Singapore Jewish community, it was not a very boundaried space. You know, there was a strong Jewish identity, but there was necessarily exchange, multiple exchanges between different communities and many different languages. So yeah, we have bits, you know, it's a very it's a real medley.
And how common were these sort of mixed marriages, would you say?
That's another very spot-on question. So there was a rabbi who eventually married into our family, Jacob Shababo, and someone needs to write his biography. He was originally Romanian, but he had spent time in Egypt and then Palestine, arrested by the British, supposedly for spying because he was a Zionist before the foundation of Israel. And David Marshall brought him to Singapore, and he came from a family of rabbis, and he was, you know, of course, the Sephardi don't do Orthodox, non-Orthodox, but he was traditional. But he looked at Singapore and he thought, well, either I convert these Chinese women to Judaism or we lose Jews. And I think he just went with it. So there were a few Chinese women who converted along with my grandmother at various points. It's a good question. Yeah.
No, very interesting. So I'm just having a look at the chat. Well, a few thank yous to you. Very, very interesting. And of course, you're all urged to buy the book, which is Loving Strangers, published by, what is it again?
Black Spring.
Black Spring. Can I just read one of the endorsements, which is, I mean, you've got fabulous endorsements on the back cover. Claudia Roden, who I'm sure many of you know, says, a beautiful and moving story that brings to life a fascinating part of Jewish history. And there's Nancy Miller, who you mentioned. She says, J. Prosser brings a fascinating new geography to the maps of Jewish roots memoirs. This odyssey to reclaim his Jewish identity through the memorabilia of his mother's complex family history is both moving and compelling, a shimmering memoir of love's work, healing for our fractured times. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, Jake, can I ask you a question? Your grandmother had the box. What memento are you going to leave for the family going forward?
The book.
The book.
Of
Yeah.
course, of course.
Not
The
being
many
clever.
books.
Only if you do the photographs, Leslie.
Yeah. Oh,
How
of course I will. I actually posted a question in the chat because I read the book, and it's always so fascinating to hear this family memoir. I knew very little about the history of Far East Asia on the World War II. I wanted to know, actually, post-war, there was a very progressive and inclusive politics under David Marshall. Would you say this was very representative of the Jewish, community at the time and its values?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. Yes, because he was also elected to leadership positions in the Jewish community. So he founded and became president of the Jewish Welfare Board, for example, which organized Jewish community life. He was president of the synagogue, I believe, at a certain point. So they elected him as representative, and he, you know, he's still held in very high esteem. He wanted to bail out of British colonialism faster than Lee Kuan Yew, and he also would have no truck with the communists. And Lee Kuan Yew was slower, you know, wanted to keep everybody on board. And ultimately, I don't think that the Singaporeans could place David Marshall. You know, he was an Asiatic. Under British colonialism, he was classified as Asiatic along with all Baghdadi Jews. So what I failed to mention is that my family, when they fled Singapore, they were not allowed below deck. It was at whites only below deck, and they were considered Asiatics. They were considered non-white. But for the Chinese, for the dominant Chinese, he was obviously not Asian in the sense that they were Asian. And Marshall embraced that Asian identity, but I think they needed a Chinese leader in the end, you know. Yeah, and Lee Kuan Yew, well, we'll just stop there, but obviously was hugely important to modern Singapore. But yeah, I think Marshall, I've gone beyond your question, Leslie, but I think he was representative of the Jewish community and held in very high esteem, and really should be a figure that we know a lot more about. Oh, someone's just put something about David Marshall in the chat.
He was right. Alan Fahy says David Marshall was buried with Singapore honours. Well deserved. Yes, yeah, that's right. Yes, he was Mash'al, I think.
Yes, he was. Yeah. And yeah, it was a British colonial who told him to change his name. His father to change the name because he said, no one can pronounce this or spell it. You know, you need a proper name.
And Alain also mentions that he has a close Chinese friend who converted to Judaism when she married an Ashkenazi Jew in Singapore. So there's another example. But interesting what you say, that they were considered Asiatic. I mean, this is a lesson for all those who think of Jews as white supremacists nowadays, isn't it?
For sure, that drives me nuts. That absolutely drives me nuts. You know, oh, well, I know I'm being recorded here, but here we go. I'm going to put it on record. You know, Jews are white and they're, you know, colonists. Well, you know, do some history, do some research. You know.
Absolutely.
Well, I was going to just reflect on many trips to Hong Kong. You used to go to the synagogue in Robinson Road, and there were many Chinese women married to investment bankers and bankers who'd come to Hong Kong. There were a lot of converts. Didn't see that many in Singapore, but in Hong Kong, many more.
Alain wants to speak.
Right, okay.
Well, I want to tell you that I lived in Singapore from 88 to, you know, continuously till 1993, and then I've been going back ever since. So I know a lot of the people that you mentioned, Elias, all these names. I knew the community, and there is a synagogue. There is a cemetery that used to be on Orchard Road, and they moved it to the far east end of the town. And because of space, they put tombs with 4 names on them, just to get more people in that small area. But at the synagogue, there were a lot of Chinese wives. There was a lot of Chinese wives.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my grandfather was disinterred in the 1970s from the Thompson Road Cemetery and put in a shared grave in it's called Chow King Cemetery.
Yeah, Chow King, Kang.
Yeah, Kang, that's it. Yeah, and so but you know, that's
but it's not a common grave. each family member were put together, and they had the 4 plaques on the on one particular square or rectangle. So it's not a common cemetery; it's a Jewish section, exclusively Jewish.
It is, yeah. But you know,
Fran wants to ask a question. He's been waiting very patiently.
Ephraim?
Yes. I just wanted to say about what you said about Jews being represented as white colonialists. There is now an independent inquiry about anti-Semitism at a campus in London. And in August, I presented a statement as long as a book, and bearing in mind that it is later by a barrister who wears a turban, I explained the situation of Iraqi Jews, about the Mizrahim in Israel. And the first image that I put is a photograph of Rabbi Yosef Hayim with a lot of other Jewish men wearing turbans from the late 19th century. And I said, are these white colonialists? And then I said, you know what? In Baghdad, the name for the Turkish face was Fina, that is Vienna. Why? Because it was, the faces were imported from the Habsburg Empire, from a town that is now in the Czech Republic. And I told them, well, you can't say now that you are actually Czech settlers because of the Ottoman turbans that were from the Habsburgs.
A history lesson.
Very good point. Yeah. And Selina adds the definition of a non-white community is a non-European language and culture. Doesn't say anything about having lived in Europe for centuries. Both Jews and Romanis, gypsies fit this description. End of. Quite right. Okay, so thank you from Yin Lin.
Yes,
So,
who edits, I'm going to do a plug here, the wonderful Hinterland, the place to publish if you're into creative nonfiction or memoir.
yes. What does he edit? Yeah.
It's called Hinterland.
Hinterland,
which publishes wonderful short memoirs.
Okay. Make a note of that. That's great. Okay, well, I think we're coming to the end of this session. I just want to thank you so much, Jay. That was absolutely fascinating. Everybody, buy the book. Go ye and buy the book. Loving Strangers. I hope it won't be the last book you write, because you write beautifully. Perhaps you have other ideas.
I hope the next one won't take me 20 years anyway, but
Are there any more objects in the family?
on the other side, yes. Yes.
That's right. You've got to write your father's story now.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll stop recording now and then
Okay.